How's it going? This is the behind the scenes video of the Lunar Landing design. This was a design that was hand painted in gouache, which is an opaque watercolour medium. So first off, we sketch the loon, which is the main subject of the design. This is just using standard pencil on watercolour paper. And where possible, try do one smooth stroke rather than multiple small scratchy strokes. I'm not very good at sticking to my own rule there though. And then we start mixing up our colours. And I like to start with a large flat brush and then work my way down as I go. And you can use the brush in multiple different ways to get multiple different marks. Here's a bit of wet on wet technique. Before the underlayer of paint has dried, I'm putting more wet paint on top of that, and the colours blend together. And here I'm just tapping the very tip of the brush to get lines. So you can make quite a variety of marks with a flat brush. Moving over to some lighter colours now for some highlights. And here I'm using a small round brush. And I want the colours to blend a little bit, so I'm dabbing some water on top of the wet paint so it disperses the pigment a bit. This brush is called a rigger brush. It has long bristles and it's very good for doing line work. And because I'm using gouache, which is an opaque watercolour, I don't have to mask out any of the lighter colours. I can just paint directly on top of the previous layer. And the white colour with gouache is actually very opaque, so it's very good for covering over even dark colours. Now, it wouldn't be as good as trying to go over, say, oil paint. Because of the water-based medium, you can actually end up picking up some of the colours underneath accidentally, and that's particularly true of gouache. So you have to be careful not to reactivate the colour underneath. And here I'm just using the back of the brush, so this is the paintbrush handle that I've dipped into the paint directly, and using that to create dots. And back to the rigger brush. Loons have a kind of a reddish brownish eye, so it's a bit hard to see here because of the shadows, but you'll see it again in the scan. And here's the scan of the loon drawing. Now we're moving on to the next component of the illustration, which is the astronaut's helmet. So we're just sketching in the astronaut's helmet here in pencil. You can see here I've got a little bit of wet on wet bleed that I didn't want. I get very impatient waiting for the layers to dry, so really I should have paused and let the previous lighter layer dry before I started with this darker colour. You can see there it's bleeding directly into the colour, my impatience coming out. Now these images are going to be composited together in Photoshop, so I'm not too concerned about getting everything perfect because I can adjust and retouch things later. Here I'm just fixing up those areas where the paint bled together. I've let the layers dry at this point. And you can see that that light colour, the white, is very opaque. You can even go over the dark areas successfully. And here's the scan of the astronaut's helmet. The next element of the illustration is the surface of the moon, and for this part I'm not starting with a sketch, I'm going straight in. I'll figure it out as I go along. So the surface of the moon has a very sharp contrast between the bright areas and the dark areas. So this is going to be a monotone, mostly grey environment with very sharp white and black highlights and lowlights. And usually when you're painting a landscape, you would start with the areas that are furthest away. But in this case, the furthest away part, as in the sky, is going to be black because it's space. And while gouache is an opaque medium, it can struggle over very dark colours. So we're going to block in the sky after doing the landscape. And adding some moon rocks. This is just straight white. And it picks up some of the darker colour underneath and turns slightly grey. And we have harsh shadows coming from the same direction. I liked how much the rocks looked that I started adding loads of little rocks in. Maybe a little too trigger happy there, but I like the way it looks. And here's the final scan of the surface of the moon. Now we take all of these scans, bring them into Photoshop and isolate them. Sure, there's a quicker way to extract a shape, but I wanted fine control over the edge, so I did it manually here with the lasso tool. So we just removed the background there, and we added a layer of pure black so that we can see if there's any edges that aren't as clean as we'd like them to be, and then we go through and clean them up. So now we're going to fix up any of the messy bits on the painting itself, and we're using the spot healing brush and the clone tool here. So that's the loon illustration finished, and we'll move on now to the astronaut's helmet. So it's the same procedure again. We want to remove the background, clean up any edges, clean up any messy bits in the painting itself, and then crop it down to size. And I'm not too concerned about the pencil marks that you can see showing underneath the paint. I actually quite like the texture of those, so I'm not going to remove all of them. So now I want to cut out the visor part of the helmet, because the bird will obviously be wearing the helmet. So this allows us to play with the layers to make it look like the bird is wearing the helmet. So just making sure that the selection is correct. And clean up the edges. And now we're going to move on to the surface of the moon. And I like this edge that isn't straight, so I want to preserve that by using the lasso tool. And as I was using a notebook for this that has tear out pages, you can see a little bit of the perforation there showing through, so I'll just clean that up. Now I want to remove the sky. If this illustration is going on a product with a black background, I want the product itself to be the sky rather than the illustration. So I remove that onto its own layer so that I can change the visibility of it depending on which product this illustration will be printed on. And now it's time to put the composition together. So taking the three different elements, the surface of the moon, the loon and the astronaut's helmet, we're going to composite them together into our finished illustration. So I want the loon to feel like it's sitting in the landscape, so part of it will be behind this rock rather than in front of it. And I struggled a little bit here with getting the right shape of the astronaut's helmet. I'm skewing it, but the beak protrudes out of the helmet. And to make that work, I needed to consider a different way of managing the helmet, because if I made the helmet large enough to contain the beak, then it would look out of proportion with the rest of the body. So in the end, what I decided to do was to have an extra part of the helmet that protrudes out to cover the beak. And playing around with the layer blending options here to show the highlights on the visor. And for the shadow, I'm just going to take a layer selection and then skew it so that the shadow follows the same direction as the shadows on the rocks. And I'm filling the shadow with the texture that we have for the sky, so it doesn't look as stark as just pure black, and it has some of the painted texture. And because that rock is in front of the loon, it's not cast in shadow. And there we have our final illustration. Please like, share, comment, subscribe if you like this content. Click that bell if you want to be notified of more. And as always, thank you for watching. Catch you later.